which brings us to our next conversation, one that I think we all will agree is a crucial one. And we're going to start with a video.
At first, I didn't understand. A boy at my school sent me this picture. It didn't make any sense. I didn't take that photo. The next day, everyone was messaging me. The boys in my class kept sending me these pictures. All night. It was a nightmare. The pictures were fake. They looked so much like me. They looked so real that everyone thought I took them.
Please welcome the editorial director of Fortune Most Powerful Women, Ellie Austin.
Hello, everyone. So we just watched a very short clip of a short film that we're going to talk about in a second. It was very impactful, I'm sure you can agree, pretty scary as well. We've all witnessed the ways in which technology is impacting the lives of young people, from rising rates of anxiety and depression to diminishing concentration spans. And the conversation has only become louder and more urgent in recent months with the reaction to the hit Netflix show Adolescence. We're going to spend a lot of time today and tomorrow talking about AI's impact on healthcare, on the workplace, on business, but what is its impact on today's young people? And who are the people making sure that minors are protected from the possible risk of exploitation? To discuss this further, please help me welcome to the stage two people who are at the absolute forefront of this incredibly important conversation. They are Baroness Joanna Shields, OBE, who is the founder of We Protect Global Alliance, an organization developing tools, solutions, and policies to keep young people safe online. She's also a former UK Minister for Internet Safety and Security, and Emilio Puccio, who is the Secretary General of the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights at the European Parliament. Hello and welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here. As I said, to have this really important conversation, which is a slight tonal shift from everything else we've been talking about today. Now, Joanna, you executive produced the full film, of which we've just seen a clip. It's called Protect Us, the film, and it gives a very realistic and harrowing look at some of the dangers that are lurking out there for our young people when they start to use AI. Tell us a bit about the goal of the film and who the intended audience is.
So as Ellie mentioned in the opening, I founded an organization called the We Protect Global Alliance. And we have over 100 governments now actively working together to share best practices and try to help each other combat online harms and crimes, which, as you know, is an escalating enormous issue in society. And the one good thing about films like this and what's happening in the world now is there's starting to be awakening of what's really happening to children. But what we started seeing right after ChatGPT is these Nudify apps were coming out, and kids were using them to nudify each other. And the estimate now is that 3 in 10 kids are being, either know somebody or has had this happen to themselves. And the impact is devastating. Mm-hmm. And then they're using these Nudify apps in sextortion cases where they're actually enticing young people to upload an image of themselves, a sexually explicit image, thinking they're talking to somebody that likes them and that they've developed a relationship with. And then they use that for extortion. They make thousands of images using AI, and they're all over the web. So imagine the impact of a child who realizes that that trust has been broken, and they have shared that explicit image, and they're all over.
Yeah, terrifying.
It's terrifying. But what we were finding is that so many kids were being affected by this that we had to start creating media that we could push out into schools so we can have it translated into 103 different governments around the world where they can use this information to make kids more aware and to help them understand what the implications of this technology and that they're not alone. That's the most important thing.
So this is going to be on curricula in all different countries.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, Emilio, before I ask you a question, I just want to explain to people your role in a bit more detail because you've got a very lengthy title. So the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights, it's a cross-party, a cross-national group of around 150 MEPs that works to ensure children's rights are at the forefront of all EU legislation. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That is right.
Okay, so I want to go big picture for a second. Globally, how would you characterize where we are at the moment in terms of protection for children and young people when it comes to AI?
Right. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much as well for explaining as well what the Intergroup is, and very quickly as well, I'm so happy that you carved out this space today to talk about the impact on children and young people, which should actually be front and center every time we talk about the future. So now globally, I actually have to say with a hint of pride that in the European Union, I think the European Union is kind of a pioneer, is actually leading in a way the efforts when it comes to protection of children and for the challenges and new threats that are coming from the AI. As you guys have seen very well from the film, which is very realistic, I mean, AI is fantastic. It's here, new technologies are fantastic. They're helping people and they're helping as well kids and young people, but they have also created social distortion that do require an answer from the legislator. And I think this conversation has actually been happening in many other jurisdictions. So for instance, in the case of the European Union, I have to say that we have a number of pieces of legislation that are trying to tackle this. And because the problem is so difficult and so complex, we are tackling this problem both through the lenses of the criminal law. So there is a piece of legislation in the European Union that is criminalizing AI-generated child sexual abuse material from the one end, but at the same time, we have understood that criminalizing only happens after the harm is already done. So we need to actually tackle the problem upstream and tackle the infrastructure that has made this possible. And that's when the European Union came up with, this morning we actually talked, earlier today, we talked about the AI Act from the European Union, but there are other two pieces of legislation that have been actually very much that should be read in conjunction to give you the understanding of what is the legal framework, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act. So yeah, the European Union is very much leading and understanding what's the problem behind and how we best can tackle the infrastructure.
And Joanna, if we continue on the subject of legislation, earlier this year, the UK became the first country in the world to criminalize the creation, the possession and distribution of AI tools used to make child sexual abuse material. It sounds like a basic question, but how much of an impact will this have? How do you enforce a piece of legislation like that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty bold move, too, because these non-consensual images were becoming used for revenge porn and all kinds of criminality. And so, we have to rethink about people's rights and how we protect them. And, obviously our focus is on children, but it was happening to people all over society. It was a really challenging bill to kind of put through the parliament, but it's important that that they took a stand and were in the front of what's really happening out there.
What's the likelihood, do you think, of other countries following suit?
Well, I mean, it's starting to happen everywhere. I think what we're seeing now is legislation cannot keep up with the speed and what's happening and the potential of AI. And in many respects, there's the exciting parts of it, but we always see the unintended consequences. And we've suffered now from 15 years of not realizing what social media was going to do to children and the algorithmic amplification of narratives that drive them to, self-harm and suicides. And there have been over 40 suicides due to sextortion in the US just in the last 2 years alone. And I mean, those are the ones we know about. It's terrifying. So you have to, as a regulator, as a as a minister in the government, you got to stay ahead of these things. But we have to be realistic. We need industry to step up and to be much more proactive. In fact, I believe that there are a lot of things that we could solve if we could get industry to agree to a universal age signal.
And explain a bit about briefly what that is.
Well, I mean, some promising news over the weekend came out that Google has released zero-knowledge proofs as a way in their digital wallets for you to verify a child's identity without sacrificing their privacy. So there's a lot of new technologies. The reason we don't have age verification in a much more standardized way is there were lots of risks to privacy up until now, but the technology has come, so far in the last couple of years that there are multiple ways in which you can verify identity where no information of that child is transferred, and that can become like a passport that goes with them everywhere they go, so that every site they visit, they get an age-appropriate experience. And that, to me, if industry could get their act together and they could do this en masse, I think we could see a big change in this, because then there's no excuse not to build a product that is for an age-appropriate experience.
And I want to ask you both about a couple of pieces of news that have come out recently relating to industry and big tech. So let's take Meta, first of all. So last year, Meta signed up to a new set of AI principles designed to prevent exploitation of young people. And then last month, the Wall Street Journal newspaper published an investigation detailing how Meta's companion chatbots were actually often engaged in romantic and sometimes sexual role play with these young people, these underage users. So, Emilio, how does this disconnect happen between a company on the one hand publicly committing to behave in one way, and then behind the scenes, it's technology doing the opposite?
Yeah, thank you, Ellie. Actually, precisely building on what Joanna just said and left off before, I would argue that, there are very good examples and, companies, they always try to commit themselves. And I believe in business for good. But I think, and that's actually kind of the approach we take on the European Union level, we need to move from a voluntary system to a mandatory system, where that's actually the approach we've been taking in the European Union, where we actually going to set clear rules for all online services provider that have to be implemented. And so in this case, you actually avoid the risk of leaving this up to them.
So what happens if they don't comply?
So in the case, they will break in the law. They can be sued. They can be brought to justice. And that's actually what's been happening as well in the European Union already. And many companies have been actually brought to justice. They've been fined because of breaching the Digital Services Act. But the good thing is actually, once again, I can't stress enough how proud I am that the European Union have understood that, we don't want to hamper innovation. We don't want to hamper progress. But we want to make sure that human rights and victims actually are at the center of this legislation. So this legislation is very much entirely victim-centered and very much focuses on removal. And it's only by mandating company to detect the child sexual abuse material, and by the way, including as well AI-generated child sexual abuse material in all their services, and by also compelling these companies or obliging this company to report this child sexual abuse material to the authorities, and then eventually to remove. And this is done through specific surgical targeted removal orders from a judicial authority in order to avoid this so-called breaches of privacy or data protection. Because I think, in this conversation, there are so many fallacious dichotomies. On the one hand, you might argue that there is a sort of a dichotomy between children's rights and privacy. On the other hand, there's going to be a sort of a dichotomy between regulation and innovation. So I think this conversation is very complicated. And just to finish very quickly in this part, I think it's also what is very complicated is that somehow we're meant to believe that there's a sort of a difference between the online world and the real world, when in fact there is none. And I think Joanna's film is amazing in exemplifying what are the real consequences, what happens on the digital world leaves clear scars in the real life.
Yeah. I think the most exciting thing recently is over 40 governments have started to create regulations around age online. And I mean, it's really difficult. It's a fragmented world now. So companies, it's not practical. I worked at Google and Facebook, so mea culpa. But I mean, you can't deliver a product when you need to nuance it in 40 different markets. So the momentum of regulators is moving them to where they will have to self-regulate and do this en masse, which I think I'm so encouraged about that news. That they're releasing AI to young people, but they're doing it through the parent portal, but then they're also requiring that you use the zero knowledge proof to verify your age along with the digital wallet, which is really powerful. And that's the foolproof way. I mean, otherwise now companies can say, we have age restrictions, but kids just tell a lie. They just go in
get
and,
around it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Because only last week, Google's Gemini announced that it's now going to be rolled out to users under the age of 13, as long as they're using a parent-managed account.
That's correct.
What's your response to that? Is that kind of a safe way to give children access to this technology?
Parents who've signed up to this portal are already sharing Google products with their children, so they're already in that partnership with Google. So this is the way to do it, in my view. I mean, things will slip through, but the reality is that a parent is involved, and now we're verifying age so that as that child, grows up, that there will be points in time, because children change every day, right? And facial age estimation and these other methodologies enable you to say this child is now 15, because some regulatory regimes are 15 or 16. So it's coming along, but the only reason why it's really happening is, well, first of all, there's a crescendo of awareness and activism around this topic, and that is really welcome. The second thing is the fragmentation of regulation is so complex that they have to finally say, we can't sustain this the way it's been before. Because losing young customers and not being able to target them with ads and be able to deliver them certain things is a big commercial loss for them.
And one thing I want to ask you both is, in a way, the use of these chatbots is really a symptom of a much deeper problem in society, which is that children and young people are feeling disconnected, they're feeling lonely, maybe very anxious, they're spending so much time on social media that these platforms feel more appealing to them than the real world. How do we get at the deep-seated root causes of what is leading to this trend of kind of negative relationships with AI chatbots, companion apps, whatever it is?
There's so many products that are coming out there, empathetic AI, that really connect with you and fill that void.
Why aren't you getting that from a human? How do we
I know,
make it?
it's really, and I shouldn't out him, but last week Mark Zuckerberg made a video about this. And he said, if you're lonely, there's someone to talk to. And I'm like, no, that's not what we want. I can understand that, but we can't productize humanity. We can't productize a person and create something that is a substitute for real human. I found that to be a peculiar marketing tactic.
You made a good point. We caught up earlier, just before this conversation, and you said that the impact of the pandemic obviously cannot be underestimated on the way that today's young people are forming relationships. Emilio, is there anything you want to add?
Absolutely. And I think what actually we are missing in this conversation, I think we should actually talk about that more, is that we need more scientific evidence. What is the impact on these overexposure of children to social media, to screen time, to AI? We need actually much more evidence, more scientific evidence. And right now, for instance, in the case of France and Spain, now the Pediatric Association, both in Spain and France, has said that in fact it's detrimental to children's mental health. And I think you were saying, to comment on your earlier point, I think, at the end of the day, these AI and the virtual realities and as well the digital world is just a mere extension of the real life. The problem is much deeper. But I think it's important to say as well that, the very business model of these social media companies, which is actually based on getting as much attention as possible from children and taking as many data and personal data as possible, has also made this possible to cement and create the very real echo chambers where, honestly, children are, hatred, misogyny, it's a daily fare. You were talking about adolescence before.
We were talking, I mentioned adolescence in the introduction. That's so powerful because it showed you kind of, the full scope of a family life and how it's impacted. If you haven't watched Adolescence on Netflix, it's about a young boy who tragically kills a young woman in his class at school as a result of consuming this misogynistic, violent content online. We're coming to the end. I just very quickly want to ask you both, there will be a lot of parents in this room. If you could very succinctly each give them advice on how to help their children navigate AI in a way that is productive and healthy, what would it be? Joanna, we'll come to you first.
I think the most important thing is them to understand that it is not real, and that and all the good and benefits of it, the way in which you can engage and learn and create and dream and use your imagination, but know that it's an inanimate object. And AI is becoming so intelligent, so useful and powerful. And also get your kids outside. You've got to get them out into groups, into social situations. Because, I mean, if you're an introvert, I was always an introvert. I was pushed out the door by my parents even then, and we didn't have, I just read a book then. But now you can get into these deep, these deep places where you're no longer communicating. And the adolescence film, I think, was a great example of this sort of de-empowerment narrative that was algorithmically pushed through influencers and various others. And, the results are a disaster.
Emilio?
Yeah, no, and actually, to this point, to say that as much as we would love to think that what happens again online is not real, it doesn't have the same effect, the same impact. Unfortunately, actually, it is the same. And so I want to caution parents to understand that actually what happens online, even if these kids, they believe that they are safe because they are just in their room, actually this very device, it's a connection. It can allow kids, even when they are in video platforms, to be in touch with adults. We have better intentions. And again, to caution that what happens in the digital world can really leave real scars in real life. And if I have the time very quickly to mention an example. So before writing the legislation,
15 seconds.
when I visited the Canadian Center for Child Protection, there was this young girl who has never met her abuser in real life. But during the span of time of 5 years, she was constantly abused. She was entirely at the mercy of this abuser, who was having her doing whatever he wanted, just because then he could actually then blackmail her. If she didn't do what he asked her to do, he could actually send the picture to the friends and family. So you see, they never met in real life, but the major impact was huge.
Yeah, so I think the takeaway is don't think of online and offline as two separate worlds. It's all one integrated world that today's young people are navigating. Emilio, Joanna, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.